Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show, right here on VoiceAmericaMedia.com. This is the program that shows you how to turn your problems into solutions and your obstacles into opportunities and make your dreams come true. I have been on the air with Voice America for almost 25 years now. I've had many other programs over the years and interviewed thousands of people, but I have stayed with Voice America as a mainstay through all of that and very, very happy about it. Today, we're talking about culture identity and the issues of immigration. We're talking about it from the standpoint of thinking about where you came from, your heritage. Did your grandparents or your great grandparents or your great great grandparents come to the United States? Where is the generation and what did they go through? We often don't think about that. We think about our heritage, we think about the food and the culture, and we go back and visit the country at times when we can. But we don't ever think of what did they go through to get here. And that's what we're going to talk today about. We're going to talk to Larry Zuckerman, who is the author of a new historical novel. And again, it speaks to what our tensions are in our generations of immigrants between assimilating into American culture, but also honoring our homeland traditions. So let's talk about Larry. Larry Zuckerman is the descendant of courageous Jewish people who came to America from Eastern Europe. His grandparents spoke Yiddish around him whenever they wished to protect their privacy, and their impassioned expressive tone made him want to know what he was missing. So, in paying homage to their generation and mother tongue, To Save a Life, which is the name of the book, expresses his love for other times and places. He also has a novel, Lonely Are the Brave, in 2023, which portrays a World War I hero turned at home father in a Washington state logging town. His nonfiction includes The Potato, How the Humble Spud Rescued the Western World, which was excerpted in the New York Times, and The Rape of Belgium, the untold story of World War I, which reflects his fascination with that tragic era. He's appeared on NPR's Morning Edition and delivered a keynote address at the World Potato Congress in Christchurch, New Zealand. He lives in Seattle. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, in all of your books, you're really looking at history. I mean, you're really looking at what history is and what it does. And I think it's interesting that we're looking at this from the standpoint of what did our immigrant forefathers go through before, right? So what what was the impetus for writing this book?
Some years ago, I visited the Orchard Street Tenement Museum in Lower Manhattan, and I saw an apartment that had housed generations of immigrants. And as I looked at those rooms, I thought they're matchbox sized. How many people crowded in there, 10 to the dozen? How did they have so little light or air or privacy? How did they
Yeah.
use the sink, the only one in the apartment, in the kitchen, low to the floor, the stove across the room from it?
Mm,
And I thought about the sacrifices that they had made to come to America and the sacrifices that they were continuing to make because they dreamed. They dreamed of something that was bigger than
mm.
themselves. And some didn't make it, some did, but they persevered because they had no choice. And that stayed with me and that moved me. So several years ago, when I was looking around for something else to write, I thought, now's the time.
Yeah. It's interesting when you say that because I get the image of the pilgrims coming over on the boat and what they went through and how many died. And, some made it, some didn't, some got sick. A few, the ones who made it obviously were our forefathers there, but we just often don't think about it. And so when you think about what we all went through, you aim to write a novel that captures the experience of immigrants settling in the so-called Golden Land in the early 1900s. How was their experience similar and different to that of other immigrant groups at that time?
The two largest groups were Italians and Jews in the early 1900s. And they lived pretty close together. They were on the Lower East Side, these two adjacent neighborhoods that were enclaves from which they seldom ventured. And both groups had mutual aid societies that whose members came from the same town or village or region. But after that, the similarities diverged a little bit because Italian immigrants were much more likely to be tenant farmers or poor laborers, which explains why so many of them dreamed of buying land.
Mm,
Some returned to Italy to do that. Whereas Jewish immigrants were much more likely to be the cobblers, tailors,
mm,
locksmiths, who were
mhm.
facing murderous persecution in Eastern Europe and very unlikely to return there.
Yeah,
However, in the end, though, the both groups were looking for dignity, self-respect, and a chance at a new life. So they had that in common.
yeah, that's interesting. My background is similar to yours, and my grandfather came over from Russia, escaping from the Tsar, and he became a tailor. And he actually made mink coats on a very fashionable street in Boston for very elite people who, and of course, in those days, I mean, mink coats were very much in style. And, um, and that's what he did. He put those pieces together hand by hand and would make a coat.
Mhm. It has been said that one of the reasons that there were so many tailors and locksmiths was because you could carry the tools of your trade in your pocket.
Yes, yes, yeah. And also the language, right, would be a barrier.
Yes, I mean, but Yiddish, I mean, they would have to learn one language anyway, but yes.
Yeah. And it could be, as you said, Yiddish was a combination kind of language, but there were people that spoke Russian, right? Or German or Yiddish. I mean, it was sort of a combination that you see in other countries where there are dialects, like in Ireland where there's a dialect, or even in Spain where there's different dialects of Spanish.
The foremen on the factory floors of the garment factories where many of these people wound up working would speak three or four languages easily because they had to. The employees came from various different ethnicities.
Yeah. So the book is a historical novel, and it features strong women characters, and they're struggling to build a new life for themselves in the United States. So one of the characters, who's a woman, um, faced some societal and cultural restrictions because they were women in that time. Talk about those.
One of my two main characters, Malka, flees Russia and an arranged marriage and steals her dowry to do so, which is a pretty brave thing to do,
Yes.
and for which she suffers shame for doing that, naturally. But she was not going to be beholden to the man her father had chosen, who was completely wrong for her. She would have stayed otherwise, I think, but that was just too much for her. And coming over, she saw again in the Golden Land that men still held primacy. And although she is very traditional in her outlook in many ways, the one thing she has decided is that she will not sacrifice herself for a man just because. And her aunt, with whom she lives, feels similarly. Her best friend, whom she meets soon after arriving, feels similarly to that too. So all three of these strong women, they have several things in common. They're all entrepreneurs, which is
Mm,
unusual.
mm.
And they all have decided that even though they have certain ideas that are traditional, they will not be subject to men.
Yeah, and that's brave. I mean, really, really brave, to leave what you know but that's it's the risk. It's the risk for having the life that you want. So I want to segue in and share a story when you were talking about choices were made for her that she didn't want. So in my book, my father tells the story that when my grandfather was escaping from Russia, he was at the last outpost and he stayed with a family. And the family took a liking to him and they wanted him to marry the daughter. And he didn't want to do that. And they said, well, if you don't do that, we're going to turn you in. So he escaped in the middle of the night and he came to this country. And of course, I wouldn't be here. So, but I thought that was such an interesting story.
I'm sure that there were stories like that all over. That you just don't know. My grandparents never told me theirs. All I know is that my father, this is my father's father, he emigrated at age 17. He was trying to stay out of the Tsar's army.
Yep. Same thing. Yep. Yeah. Similar.
And
Yeah.
that's all I know. And if I hadn't run across his record in the Ellis Island Foundation database, I would not have any details about it.
You know, this is a good time to say this, to mention this about sharing memories. If I hadn't written this book and included my father's stories, I would never know any of this. And I think, we can both say to people, get those memories while your family is alive. Write them down. And today it's so easy. You just put the phone up to them, right? And let them talk. I mean, 20 years ago you had to write it all down or you had to get a tape recorder and get the tape. It's just so easy. I mean, even if you don't transcribe it right away, and there are systems that let you do that, get those stories because once they're gone, the stories are gone.
My kids, much as they love me, I think I get the idea sometimes they think I don't know anything. So, and when I start to tell them about your great grandparents and this, and the other thing, and yeah, okay, Dad, pass the salt. It's like,
Yeah. Well, but then you get to a certain age where, we want to know where we came from. Maybe some people don't, but I think a lot, I mean, look at how big ancestry.com is, right? I mean, think about that. It is huge. So many people are looking at their ancestry. Yeah. So let me ask you this. You know, life for immigrants in the early 20th century in New York was difficult and uncertain. Many worked in construction, in sweatshops, in dangerous jobs, or they lived, as you said, in overcrowded, unsanitary tenements. Why do you think that they came to our country at that time, knowing the hardships they would face?
I'm not so sure that they did actually know.
Mm,
I'm sure that they never thought it was going to be seamless, but they had heard a lot of tall tales about the Golden Land, and maybe they'd had relatives who'd emigrated before them, who'd glossed over certain hard truths in their letters. But in the end, it might not even have mattered because when you are facing abject poverty or political oppression or murderous persecution or plagues or natural disasters, how much choice do you really have? And many of them left while they still had a choice.
mm, yeah, yeah. So what they were leaving was far worse than what they thought they would be getting into.
Yes, but there was also something a little bit less tangible. I mean, people like to talk about economic opportunity, but it wasn't just that. I think that they were looking for dignity and self-respect because the people who were coming over, no matter where they came from, held they weren't wealthy necessarily. They, in fact, quite the opposite, and they held very humble professions. And those professions defined them and confined them. Whereas in the countries where they came from, generally, the upper class people prided themselves on not having to work at all. So I think that prospective immigrants were looking at America as a place where work would be respected, even manual labor, and that if they came over, they thought, and applied themselves, they could hold their heads high for the first time in their lives. That exerts a very powerful draw.
Interesting. Yeah. But immigration seems to be polarizing because, during the early 1900s, critics of unrestricted immigration warned about the extinction of the Anglo-Saxon race then. And, I wonder why they believe this and why immigration was, and still is, such a contentious issue.
If you read the things that they said, the scurrilous things that they wrote. And some of these authors, incidentally, were later adopted by Nazi Germany as stars.
Mm,
They they spoke about how nothing in this country was made by anybody, any of the newcomers. It was only made by Anglo-Saxons who'd been here forever, and that the newcomers they particularly focused on, the Southern and Eastern Europeans, meaning Italians and Jews, were lazy or
mm,
feeble-minded or outright criminals. And they did that, I think, out of prejudice, but also I think out of a fear that the land that they thought, the life that they thought they had, would be swept away. And so they were able to relate to other people who felt like that, people of lower class than they, because we're talking about people who were university educated, that they all believed that everything they'd ever worked for was going to be taken away and the newcomers were going to get it. And
mm,
during times of stress, and there was an economic panic in 1907, for example, during times of economic and cultural and social stress, as we are having now, those ideas tend to recycle. And the only thing that I can say is that perhaps as many as 1 in 3 native-born Americans today can trace at least one ancestor who came over during the early 1900s. So it's
mm.
almost a third of a nation.
Wow. And the others just aren't tracing them.
I don't know if they're not tracing them or not. Maybe it's the 1/3 maybe the 1/3 of the nation that knows that they come from that time are kinder about immigrants today. I don't know. Sometimes people are like that. Sometimes they say, "Well, I came over and I've gotten mine, so too bad for you." But
Mm,
maybe they're not. Maybe it's just a
yeah,
question of times past.
yeah. Well, interesting. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the other side of this, which is, what were the joys of immigrant life, particularly with music, and what is it that our immigrant forefathers handed down to us, that even if we haven't traced our ancestry, it's somehow within us, right? We all of a sudden love this food that we didn't even realize was kind of in our system because it was part of our heritage. So we'll talk about that when we come back, is what were the joys, what were the gains, even during the hard economic times. So you're listening to the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show right here on voiceamerica.com. My guest is Larry Zuckerman, and his book is To Save a Life, and it is a historical drama. And what we're really looking at today is the current issue. We're talking about cultural identity, and it really speaks to current issues of immigration and, the inherent tension that generations of immigrant have felt assimilating into American culture, but also honoring their homeland traditions. So we have that today, we had that then, and we're going to talk more about that and what are the joys that we've learned from our forefathers. What were the joys of immigration when they got here? Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back. Hi, everyone. We are back. You're listening to the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show right here on voiceamerica.com. We are talking today to Larry Zuckerman, who is the author of the new historical novel, which is To Save a Life. And we're really looking at what immigration looked like at the dawn of the 20th century and why it's useful to recall. Because what our immigrants are going through today are some of those same struggles of leaving homelands and countries where they're in danger or they're not wanted. And then, what do they bring with them here? And so there's really so much similarity in leaving our homeland and having to start over. Larry Zuckerman is the descendant of courageous Jews who came to America from Eastern Europe. So his characters have some of the tone. This is a novel and it's fiction, but it's certainly based in what people went through during that time. And he's written several other books, both novels and nonfiction, with based in history. Welcome back, Larry.
Thank you.
So, what we're going to talk about next is we're talking about the hardships, the small spaces, not always being wanted, being a threat to the people who are already here, not having the language, um, just finding your way. So, the question now is let's turn that around a little bit and talk about the joys of immigrant life at that time, particularly with music.
These are the days before radio. And back then, an evening's entertainment might well be friends and family gathering around the piano to sing the latest songs. So that's how music publishers made their money, by selling the sheet music. And sometimes they did it in the millions of copies. A song could be that popular. So to promote the songs, they would hire musicians called pluggers who would perform in public spaces like vaudeville houses or saloons or department stores or restaurants. So the music would be everywhere. And it left a great imprint on popular culture.
Mm.
And one of the ways in which it did that was dance halls. And imagine young immigrant kids who have been sort of chained to the house for forever. And if they had been in the old country, would still be chained to the house. Well, they get to the dance hall, and what do they hear is ragtime, the music of Scott Joplin. And they do dances like the grizzly bear and the bunny hug. And you can just imagine what their parents would have thought if they had heard those names and what they would have thought was going on there. But it wasn't
Right.
just the dance halls. There were, in the 57 blocks of the Lower East Side, this statistic stunned me. There were 112 ice cream parlors and candy stores.
Mm.
So kids would hang out at those and they would talk about life. They would talk about going to the dance hall. They would talk about buying clothes. They would talk about going to the Nickelodeon, about being free. And then, so you see that they would be in a different path from where their parents had started out. And you see how that changes. So, and the music also would be, um, not only tell you, but it would tell you what the culture was like as well, because there were even a song like "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," which was a hit song of 1908, is
Mm.
actually, we know of it as the chorus to that song being very important, but the song is actually about a young woman who insists to her beau that she will not go to the theater with him. She wants him to take him out to the ball game. And when she gets to the ball game, she yells and screams and she yells at the umpire and she gets everybody in the cheering section to cheer for the team. And this is the so-called new woman of that time,
Of that
who
time.
at yes, they called it that. And so it's interesting. You can see that, wow. I looked at that and I would never have thought. And so the music was both a wonderful facet of the culture, but a reflective of it.
Mm. Yeah. Interesting. And how, as you said, the woman was called a new woman because they hadn't seen this before.
Right. Right.
Uh, Fascinating. What other ways would you say they express joy? Would it also have been through food and customs and celebrations?
Absolutely. If you've ever seen um, the Feast of San Gennaro, and people marching with a an image of a saint and with flags in the streets, and there's a huge panoply over it. I believe it takes place in Boston as well as in New York. That's where I've seen it in both places. Or Jews celebrated Shabbat. Um, you know, every Friday, work stopped, festive meal, everyone comes. It's
Yeah. Go ahead.
They found ways because they couldn't have lived otherwise,
Yeah.
and they would serve the foods that they loved. And in fact, in the novel, I write in rugelach, which is one of my favorite
Yes.
pastries. And one of my characters, when he smells it, it brings him back to age 4, and he's thrilled that
Yeah.
that
It's
at
like a
that
dough that's rolled up with raisins and cinnamon, I think, right?
and sugar, and I make it with cocoa nibs also. Which they probably
Yeah.
didn't have,
Yeah.
but it's addictive.
Yeah. Larry, question about this. If you were talking about this and you were saying, people would gather around and they'd have their custom food and their holidays. Do you think because of all of this, coming to a new place, that they would insulate so they would be among their people and not branch out as much to others? What do you think?
I don't know that that's entirely fair.
Okay.
Certainly people felt under attack. And yes, they wanted to fit in very desperately, and they wanted to be accepted, but they were also at a terrible loss. They didn't know where they didn't know where they were in a sense because they hadn't been there before. They didn't know what they were looking at because it was so different from anything they'd experienced. So naturally, they would band together, whether it was in their neighborhood associations, from the neighborhood from which they had come from, or from the neighborhood itself. They would like to live in a neighborhood like the Lower East Side, in which everybody there was going to be the same as they were or similar. Or even within their own tenement building, people would band together because they would have to pull together in order to survive. It's only natural. Or they would join a union and help and try to help working conditions. Or in their houses of worship, they would be active because that gave them a sense that they were still holding on to their identity. They
Mm,
did wish to keep their own ways to an extent, but they also wished to become American, and they were trying to find out what that was because there was no manual that said this is what this is. Everyone was willing to tell you what an American did. Every person had an individual definition of what that was, but there were no instructions.
mm. Yeah, because when I think about it, I don't think about being with a lot of other groups. I think more about being with, people of like mind, like customs, like tradition. Now, you see it more today, right? Where a lot of ethnic groups are getting together and they're sharing each other's cultures and food. But I don't know if you saw it as much then in those days of early immigration.
Probably not. I mean, there was one of the sources that I consulted about Italian life in New York City on Elizabeth Street. That was where the Italians and Sicilians lived, and they didn't necessarily speak to each other. So
Mm,
it was there was that, and then among Jews, perhaps there were some who came from certain parts of Russia, and some who came from Poland, and maybe they didn't talk to each other. So there was always that, but I think in some they were looking for a place to belong, a place to be
mm,
someone,
yeah,
and they were inventing that as they went.
yeah. And a lot of them really made something of themselves. I
Yes.
mean, I was just talking to a friend who was talking about a man who'd passed who became a real estate mogul, came from Ireland with nothing, nothing, and just, whatever it was, bought one little property and just became mega. I mean, really built apartment buildings and um, just lots of real estate.
Mhm. That could happen.
Yeah, and we see that with many cultures of immigrants who came from nothing, and then what happens is they pass it down to their family many times, right? So that the not always, but in this case, the son took it over, and in this case, the son didn't do as good a job as the dad did. But but yeah, you see that too. I mean, it's harder, but you see that where the immigrant finds something, finds a niche, and does really well. And it is just such admiration for starting from nothing.
Yes. And it's one of my characters has the idea, and it's very powerful to him, it's a very powerful idea that because other people sacrificed so that he could escape Russia, he owes it to
Mm,
them and to himself to work hard and to make a better life.
yeah, yeah. So, in writing your novels, what are some of the challenges of writing a historical novel? How do you reconcile with the particular historical periods, mores, and prejudices you write about through a 21st century lens?
Oh, that is the big question because I look at it as you have to find the mindset of a particular era. And that's not something that people always spoke about because to them it was self-evident. But once I find what their hates and loves and prejudices were, incidentally, probably very little different from those today, they just express them differently. I have to relay that faithfully with some subtlety because I can't announce it to the modern reader, but I don't want to soft soap anything. If I can't write a novel straight up, I won't write it at all because there's no point in pretending that my characters are any better than they were or that I'm tailoring them so that people who live today will love them. That's not the kind of writer I am. If I can't write somebody who's got real flaws, as a heroine or hero, or a villain who's true to himself and believes absolutely everything what he does, then I might as well give up.
Mm. And also, it's not realistic, right? Because a lot
Right.
of these things happened.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And in the next segment, we'll talk more about this. But speaking of which, your stories in your novel features several love stories, which in the early 1900s were considered unconventional and even scandalous. And you did talk about why you choose unconventional stories, but why focus on love stories where women bucked religious conventions and also social conventions?
I've always been drawn to what I call quiet subversives. That's somebody who conducts a one-person revolution just by living in a certain way. And I
Mm,
like it even better when that person is conservative or traditional by nature, so that sets up a conflict. I also believe that shame is the most powerful motivator. So you combine those two and you have a very strong combination, or so I think. And that's how I get three women in my novel who are pursuing romances that might be considered, as you say,
mm,
illicit or unconventional. And they would not know the word feminism, but they have seen freedom, they've tasted a little bit of it, and so therefore they feel that they can pursue something that they wouldn't have had in the old country.
mm, yeah. There's a lot of historical dramas that I often watch, either streaming or on TV, of stories like this. Women who were in the 19th century and 18th century who just bucked the tide and really made a name for themselves. I can't remember the movies now, but some of them were just remarkable, or they were really right behind the man who, made the invention and then family carried it on. But I mean, these are the kinds of stories that I know you write about, but also you're seeing a lot of this and streaming, I find them fascinating. I find them fascinating because the love is intertwined with the business and it's intertwined with, you know, raising a family and still trying to have a relationship, but everything's really the business. It's really a fascinating story, these stories of survival in many ways.
It's there's another thing about these women. They're also entrepreneurs, and being an entrepreneur was a way out of the sweatshop, but for women, it was very unusual for them to do that.
Mm,
And
mm,
so, in fact, there are five characters in the novel who are entrepreneurs or trying to be, because that was considered the way.
yeah, very, very paving the way for women today. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about immigrants and the struggle in America for workers' rights and immigration. And sometimes this was fought by immigrants, people who were Jewish, and other immigrants as well. And so we're going to ask Larry about that. And we're going to ask Larry about different phrases, religious phrases, like in the Jewish culture, the Yiddish phrases that people used, but also phrases that other cultures have used or other languages have used that are particular to that group of people. As we said, sometimes there are many different sects or groups within that country or that the different dialects. So we'll talk about that when we come back. And we'll also talk about what is it that we can learn from our immigrant ancestors, because we're all immigrants, whether it's the first, second, third, fourth, or sixth generation or eighth generation. We're all immigrants. What can we learn? What are the lessons and why it is important to tell these stories? So those are all coming up in our third and last segment today with Larry Zuckerman, who is the author of To Save a Life, a historical novel. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back. Hi, everyone, and we are back. We are talking to Larry Zuckerman, who is the author of the historical novel To Save a Life. And he's written novels as well as nonfiction, focusing on history. And he's the descendant of courageous Jews who came to America from Eastern Europe. And his parents spoke Yiddish around him, so he really did not really know what he was missing because he didn't understand it. Um, but he wants to pay homage to their generation and mother tongue, and To Save a Life expresses his love for other times and places. He also wrote Lonely Are the Brave, which portrays a World War I hero turned at home father in a Washington state logging town. And then his nonfiction books are The Potato, How the Humble Spud Rescued the Western World, and then also The Rape of Belgium, The Untold Story of World War I, with its fascination about the era. So a lot of history, and it's so interesting. Welcome back, Larry. I want to go back here. I think it's really interesting about some of the obstacles that our ancestors, that the immigrants faced, right? So when we think about it, we think about not just them coming here in their life, but what about their struggle for workers' rights and unionization? Um, how did they handle this? How did the immigrant Jews handle this? And how important was all of this? And what were other obstacles that they had to move through?
It was very difficult for them. Immigrants in general had very few choices as to what jobs they could get. And those who were among the quote unquote less favored immigrants, as in Italians and Jews, would face even more trouble. And both groups were very heavily in the garment industry, which expanded rapidly in the early 1900s. And the conditions there were pretty bad, exploitive. They would have to, for instance, the shirtwaist makers, the shirtwaist was an essential item of feminine attire. And literally, the industry sprang up practically overnight. Hundreds of factories opened in the first few years of the century. Mostly women worked in them, 56 hours a week on average.
Wow.
They might be laid off during slack season. They might have to pay for the needles they used, for the electricity they
Mm,
used, for the
mm,
chair they sat in, for the locker that they
really?
put their clothes in. They could be fined by a foreman for any infraction, real or imaginary. And the unions were very largely struggling to do anything about this. And in 1909, which happens to be the year my novel takes place, which is why I know a little bit about it, there was a strike in that summer that targeted 5 factories. Now, there were 30,000 shirtwaist makers, so the 5 factories was a small fraction of it. And in November of that year, there was a 23-year-old Ukrainian immigrant named Clara Lemlech who insisted to be allowed to speak at a union meeting. And when she got up to the platform, she yelled at everybody. And she said, "This leadership is craven. They are intimidated. They won't do anything. I say we all walk out." 2 days later, 20,000 of them did.
Wow.
It was something. Now, there were still 12,000 others who were working, some of whom joined the strike as it continued. The strike continued for several months.
And this is
And
all in the novel. This is part of a
no,
story.
no, this is actual historical fact. One of my characters sees some of the that was called the strike of the 20,000. One of my characters sees them picketing one day. That's the extent of it.
Mm.
The novel begins with a strike patterned after the one that happened that summer.
Wow.
Um, but anyway, the strike of the 20,000 went on for a couple months. Neither side would yield. And then finally, the union won. They got higher wages, shorter hours, recognition in almost every shop. And the almost matters because the shop that didn't was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. And if you know anything about the history of that era, the name will ring a bell because in 1911, the place burned down and almost 150 workers lost their lives.
Oh,
The worst disaster in New York City industrial history.
was it arson?
No,
We don't know.
no, it wasn't at all. The garment industry creates a lot of lint. The lint is flammable. It caught fire from, I think, a bad electrical connection, and the doors had been locked to
Oh,
keep the workers in.
oh,
So they had no choice except either to burn to death or to jump.
hmm,
So those were among the obstacles that immigrants faced in the workplace.
hmm. What about obstacles they faced personally?
That's the thing about freedom. When you've never had it and you suddenly do, there are all sorts of choices to make, and you have no idea what the right one is. Because when you've been told earlier in your life, this is how it has to be, you may hate it, but you have no choice. It's not worth thinking about, is it?
Hmm,
Well, suddenly,
you
when
have a
you come to a
choice.
place where people talk about you can make your own life, you have to ask, well, how do I do that? How much does it cost? What will I have to give up?
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes bewildering in that
Yeah.
sense.
You know what that reminds me of, Larry? Reminds me of people who win the lottery who never had money, right? And then a year later, they don't have any money because they absolutely did not understand that concept. They've never had it, so they didn't know how to make the choices. I mean, hopefully, people are smarter and get financial advisors, but not everybody does.
And back then, there were no real advisors
Yes.
certainly
Yeah.
not honest ones. There were plenty of people who were willing to try to scam you any way they
Yeah.
could because that's human nature, I think.
Yeah. Fascinating. Your characters use Yiddish words and phrases. Now, other nationalities, they would use their own. Let's say Irish might use Gaelic, and not everybody speaks that.
Right.
Or Spanish might use Catalan, which is a dialect that not every Spanish person knows. So, but your character used Yiddish words and phrases, and your dialogue sometimes reflects that Yiddish speech pattern, rendered in English, as with such wrong you do me, instead of you do me such wrong. What are you accomplishing, or what's your goal with using Yiddish?
Um, it's not only for me a cultural time, but it's the sentence that you chose. The speaker is trying to say that the wrong is greater than the you or the me. And that's why it comes first. And
See.
I grew up hearing that from my grandparents. And there are also obviously, there's certain expressions that to me have zest. So I wanted to create a kind of mindset. Remember, I said that writing historical fiction is about a mindset. That was what I thought Yiddish would do. It would help create that.
Um, which it has, and there are so many. I mean, it's a language unto itself, but it is a mixture, correct? It has German roots.
German, Polish, Russian,
Hmm.
from all over Eastern Europe.
Some people have said that it's dying out, that it's not being used as much today.
Oh, that's true. That's true. My brother actually studied it so that he could learn to speak it.
Hmm. Oh, fascinating. Larry, when you think about all this, when you think about the book that you wrote and the novels that you write, what is your purpose in this for you and for all of us? What is it that you would like the reader to gain, no matter what their faith or tradition is? What would you like them? What's your goal here?
I'm showing people who have taken a heavy blow, shattering blow, in life, and they have to pick themselves up. Everybody,
Survival,
everybody has,
resilience.
yes, everybody has known that. These are people who happen to be immigrants. They happen to have traveled alone, which was a very frightening thing to do, practically with just the clothes on their back. Yes. But they struggle to find a niche for themselves. And they also do one other thing. They hold on to their dreams and they ask themselves hard questions every once in a while. They say, am I doing this the right way? Am I hurting myself? Am I getting in my own way? What should I do? They don't always come up with the right answer, but they ask the question. And I think that's very important. That's self-reflective quality. I think that's something else to learn. But holding on to your dreams, and even if you have to trim them back a little bit, remaining true.
Mm. What do you think we can each learn from our own ancestors, whatever our faith is?
I think to understand, try to understand what it was like for them,
Mm.
because it's so easy for us who are modern and we have so much that they didn't.
Yes.
Why would they have left the countries of their birth? What were the forces involved? Would we be able to do the same if we faced the same pressures? To
Mm.
have some respect, to have
Good word.
to have some understanding of the
Mm.
forces, because they might seem old-fashioned, maybe they were. They might have seemed even rigorously rigid, perhaps. But there's a reason for that. What was that reason? What did they think it would gain them to be that way? What did they fear? What were they working toward, as well as what were they running away from? I think there's a great deal to be learned from that because it's who we are.
Yes. Yes. In our DNA, right?
Yeah.
In our DNA, yes. Wonderful. How can people find your book?
My website, www.larryzuckerman.com or bookshop.org.
Okay. And it's LarryZuckerman.com. Okay.
Yes.
Larry, thank you. It's been very insightful. Thank you for sharing your stories and the story in the novel and just the perspective of what our immigrant ancestors and forefathers went through to help us appreciate that and understand it. Right. And
Thank
know
you.
it's part of us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Stay on the line for a minute. Thank you so much. All right, folks, that wraps up this edition of the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show. If you would like to have a copy of my newsletter, which I send out the first day of every month, write to me, Patricia at patriciaraskin.com. And the newsletter contains all of the guests that I'm having on for that month and photos and descriptions. All right. Also, if you would like to get your positive message out, as you see, that's what we do on this program. And you'd like to create your own podcast or your own podcast series. I've interviewed over 6,000 people in my career and would love to help you. So write to me, Patricia at patriciaraskin.com. Remember, stay healthy, stay happy, get the support you need, and know you can make your dreams come true. Until next time, I'm Patricia Raskin. Bye for now.